Your spirit waver now. The battle is at hand. Fight on with your heart before you. Someone, courage now to stand.
What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Heroes Veritas podcast. I'm your host, Tim Bass, and I have a confession. So today's YouTube video is going to be just a little bit different. I made a total new mistake, and I recorded the audio of the podcast, and it came out spectacular. I absolutely loved how well it came out. I was very passionate, so I didn't want to re-record it, but I was a total noob, and I failed to hit the record button on the video. So I was going to re-record, but again, I really like the audio. So what I've done instead is I've spliced together a bunch of epic shots of nature to overlay the audio onto. Instead of seeing my beautiful face for the next 20-30 minutes, you're going to be watching a quick montage fade in and out of different nature scenes. So enjoy that. And moving forward, I will be sure to record the videos of the podcast so that I don't have to give you guys a bunch of nature indoctrination. Hope to see you on the next podcast as well. If you're not subscribed, make sure to subscribe, like, share, comment. I love the conversation that we've been having lately. So let's go ahead and get into it. And today we're going to be talking about mastery, the third foundational virtue of being a man. Again, I want to remind everybody that these virtues are amoral. They don't have any moral principle added to it. There's no subjectivity applied to it. And so what I mean by that is the foundational virtues can be applied in a plethora of different ways. Strength, courage, mastery, honor. Honor is probably the only subjective concept of the foundational virtues that we actually have. Courage, for instance, can be determined in a lot of different ways depending on how your tribe sees it, how your perimeter is set. Strength, again, there's strength of character, there's strength of physicality, there's strength of will. There's a lot of different ways to view strength. And so while you need to possess a lot of different versions of strength, what kind of strength is really going to be based on how you set your perimeter and how you look at the implementation of those virtues. However, as I describe these in an amoral fashion, without the subjectivity, with the objectivity of the context by which we use in masculinity and applying our will to our perimeter, as in strength, courage, and today's mastery and tomorrow's honor. Maybe not tomorrow, but when the next episode comes out. The objectivity of those is that without the objective version of those virtues, you will not be able to set a perimeter, protect a perimeter, build a tribe, provide for a tribe, or thrive as a tribe. And therefore, that's the objectivity of it. Now, you can get into the minutia of each of those virtues as I do get into discussions with various people, whether it be over my DMs or on the comments. But what we're covering here is just the surface level conceptualization of the four foundational virtues. As we get into the later podcasts and as we have guests on and we talk more, we're going to get into more of the minutia. We're going to get into what Heroes Veritas deems is the subjective value of those different things. One of the comments we had on the video for covering courage is, and actually it could have been on strength, but they said that it dived a little bit more into pride. And I went back and I listened to it, and I realized that the reason that it seemed like it was diving into pride was because of the examples that I was giving. Now, again, the examples that I was giving was touching a little bit more on the minutia than the objectivity, and that's something that I need to remedy as I move forward when talking, is creating a true gap or separation between the subjective side and the objective side. So I do apologize if that caused any confusion when we were talking about strength. But these are meant to be core value, not core values, because values are by nature subjective. These are core virtues, and by nature of the virtue, they are amoral, they're broad, they're wide-ranging, they don't get into the minutia. They're a generic, broad brush concept that you can implement underneath everything else of your ideology, whatever that looks like for you. So that being said, let's jump into the third foundational virtue, which is mastery. This was a concept that I really didn't understand. I shouldn't say I didn't understand. I didn't think to add it to the foundational virtues until I actually read Jack Donovan's books. And the reason is because mastery doesn't necessarily create a synergy with the other virtues the same way that courage and strength do, and honor does with strength and courage, because honor kind of gives an idea of how to leverage and how to implement that strength and courage and what we define as strength and courage and so on and so forth. But mastery is a concept that can be both tangible and ethereal. It can be both ideological and physical. And it's kind of a unique concept in as a virtue. But once I read into the core definition of mastery, and I read more into Jack Donovan's books, and I read more into ancient civilizations and how they developed premise on their code of conduct, the premise on their, what it means to be good at being a man versus just being a good man, I realized that even in today's society, as kind of perverse and as odd as it is, there's a certain level of identity that comes along with mastery, that I finally understood that without a concept of a fundamental skill set, you cannot hope to provide the same level of impact, and I'm trying to think of a better word than articulation, but you can't hope to implement any of your ideological thought processes on anybody else, because you're going to be looked at as an idiot. And you won't be taken seriously. And if you're not taken seriously, then you can't commit to any ideology that's going to last or persist. You're going to end up getting enveloped into something else or dismissed altogether. And when we get into honor, we'll talk about getting cast out of the tribe, because that's where that comes into play. But mastery is one of those things that is both self-serving and selfless. And here's why. Without mastery, men won't have purpose. If they don't dedicate themselves to a skill set that they can work on, develop, and hone, and eventually either monetize or get ego strokes for, if they cannot develop themselves into a skill set that they can in turn leverage in a competitive manner, there's going to be a piece of them that feels empty. That's the selfish side of that. They're not going to feel whole because they don't bring anything to the table. They don't offer anything. And so they're going to start to compare themselves. And this is where we get a lot of, a lot of guys falling off of standards of conduct, is because they, and we also get this a lot of times with, our society's concept of toxic masculinity and things like that, because there's statements like man up, handle your business, play hurt. These are all concepts that, while they have a root in strength and in courage and things of that nature, they really come from, you need to be good at something. You need to contribute something. You need to bring something to the table. And if you fail to do that in that particular space, whatever you're expected to do, whatever that expectation is, you have no value. You have no use. And without utility in a tribe, again, this is under the context of amoral. This is on the context of life or death. If you have no utility in a tribe, then you're a liability. And what a liability means is, if you have no utility, then when outside raiders come in to take our resources, or we have a light winter and we didn't get enough food to prep for the upcoming, blizzard, if it's in an inclement weather situation, you no longer contribute in a way that make feeding you necessary, and you don't have a skill set that helps protect or provide for the tribe in a way that if outside raiders came in, you would do anything that would help the tribe, and therefore you become a liability to the survival of that tribe. So that is where I finally understood that mastery in the sense of selfishness, being able to dedicate ourselves to something for ourselves, to build ourselves into something, to protect our egos, to protect our sense of worth, is also hand in hand with selflessness of that mastery, of being able to contribute to your tribe. I like to say protect and provide. That's kind of the main two functions and roles of men as I see it. You're expected to protect those that cannot protect themselves, and you're expected to provide for those that cannot provide for themselves. Those are subjective concepts. So we haven't covered those yet, but we will cover those and what they mean and how they apply. But we've lost that utility in our current society. The archetype that we have for the man is no longer that of the protector and the provider. It's of the bumbling idiot. You look at any media outlet or anything like that. There's no longer an expectation that they need to do anything. I think in an earlier podcast episode, I brought up the concept or the use case of the 35-year-old man living in his mom's basement shouting upstairs for Pop Tarts or whatever. And I said at that time, and I continue to believe it to this day, I wish that was an ironic concept. I wish that was something to be funny or satirical, but it's a real thing. That is something that somebody agrees is okay, and it's not okay. It's not okay to live off of your mom. It's not okay to live off of your dad. The goal of you as a human should be to become self-sufficient. And as a man, it should not only be able to be self-sufficient and take care of yourself, it should be to take care of others as well, whether that's, I like to say set your perimeter. It's whatever you decide is important to your circle, you need to find a way and have the capacity to provide for that perimeter, whatever that be is. Now, if it's selfish, right, and you don't set a perimeter outside of your own self, then obviously mastery needs to support you. You need to be able to feed yourself, clothe yourself, give yourself shelter, stay alive, bathe, create, so be able to work and assimilate into whatever the cultural norm is for you, whatever group you align to. And so that's where mastery comes in, even at the selfish self-preservation level, is you need to be able to at least have a basic knowledge of that. And past that, when I hear mastery, I think the gravitas of the word mastery, I think something much larger than just, I can whistle. I'm pretty good at whistling. That's not what I think of when I hear mastery. When I hear mastery, I think of the word to master something at a degree or a level that others couldn't even hope to achieve. And that takes time, patience, articulation, intelligence, and a dedication that many people in today's world honestly don't have the patience for, because we have an instant gratification society. And so mastery's gone by the wayside. We no longer look at people and say and hail their good deeds as things that they're good at, except for things that we see on social media. If somebody can dance really good on TikTok dances, they're like hailed as the new famous, right? You have a model who can show her ass, all of a sudden she's famous. Or guy, I've seen it both ways. They become quote unquote famous, but they haven't really accomplished anything. They haven't dedicated themselves to anything. Versus a man, I like to go back in time and look at kind of the smaller, more nuclear tribes. You have blacksmiths and cooks and carpenters and tradesmen and hunters and trappers and gatherers. And you have all these different jobs that play out in a role that you have to be good at. And different rites of passages were based on what you were good at, and you would be placed into a category or a pecking order or a class system or a system of value within the society that you're in, whatever tribe that you're aligned to, based on your skill set. And now it's more about like how well you can treat people. They want nice guys. But once upon a time, the tribes were all about the mastery in combat. Who could be the toughest, the strongest, the ones who can protect them from the wolves, the elements, and other outside tribes. They were considered and hailed the highest of mastery because they've dedicated themselves at risk of their own life to protect the greater good of that perimeter of that tribe. And then below that, you have the people that had to sustain the tribe, keep it the places working and running and creating. And then women were just below that because they were the caregivers. They were the ones that created the intercommunal conversations. And so mastery had a very unique developmental path in the history of humanity because it was, the ends justified the means. So if I wasn't good at hunting, then I would need to be able to contribute a different skill set, a different mastery to the tribe that would make me less of a liability, whether that was blacksmithing, cooking, making sure the horses were trained and fed, the dogs were trained and fed, whatever the case was, I had a role. And since the utility of man has subsided in society, the necessity for a mastery, this necessity of developing skill sets, has in turn also gone away. So I'd like to give this example of what I'm talking about. In today's society, what I get approached with when I express my excitement or desire to learn something new is, well, why would you need to do that? And the response I always give is the same response I have for a lot of things. I'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it. You don't know what the new day brings. You have no idea what situations are coming up. And so for me, if I see myself as the provider, the protector, then I need the skill sets developed ahead of time before I need them in order to have them when I need them. So even though you don't necessarily see the purpose of them in that moment, if you can think and stretch the imagination just a little bit further and say, okay, well, this is the role I expect to play. And again, objectively, I'm not saying you have to be the protector. I'm not saying you have to be the provider. I'm not saying you have to do any of that. Selfishness or selflessness, whichever path you choose, whatever perimeter you set, you have to be able to look 3 to 5 steps ahead and say, okay, well, if that's the accomplishment I want to achieve, if that's the goal I'm setting, whether that's, more money, better clothes, better food, better place to live, better quality of life, or on the flip side, the selflessness, I want to provide for my church, I want to provide for my family or my group of friends, or I want to travel more with my group of friends, or I want to be able to take care of my old community, whatever that looks like. At some point, you have to look at, okay, well, what do I have that I can contribute to accomplish that end? And that's what mastery does for us. And that's why it's a virtue, because without mastery, you're just a walking, talking liability. And we see that a lot in today's world. With no utility to mastery, we now have a greater population who are coddled and entitled because they've never been expected or asked to do or learn anything. Instead, they were told, you can do whatever you want. Okay, you can do whatever you want, but nobody gave them the caveat. You can do whatever you want, provided that you put the time and energy into learning the skill set and developing yourself and separating yourself from the thousands of millions of other people that are doing the same damn thing. So with mastery, I kind of covered its utility and its importance as a man, and objectively what it is and what it's for. One of the things that came up on one of the conversations I was having was on the courage topic, is like, what's the difference between the courage virtue of somebody who, pulls a gun to help police but ends up getting in the way and doing something stupid, as opposed to the courage of somebody who chose not to get involved, not because they didn't have the courage, but they saw the situation and they understood that getting involved would just make it more difficult. And that's where mastery comes in. Mastery isn't just skill set development, it's also wisdom. Mastery is about developing understanding and the wherewithal to understand not only when to apply and how to apply a skill, but when not to, and when not to apply that skill, right? There's going to be times where you may have the skill, but you're in a room filled with other skilled individuals. So if you're learning from an instructor and you may know a little something, it's probably not the best time to pop off at the mouth and jump in the middle of it and say, oh, I know how to do this, and be the know-it-all. It's just not relevant. Or to cite the example that we had in the conversation on the comment box was, if there's a police standoff and there's a shooter and this guy's carrying a concealed carry and he feels in his mind, I'm trained, I'm capable, I am armed, then I need to get involved and separate this. Well, you could make that decision depending on the situation. It's possible that it might be necessary, but more than likely you're going to end up making yourself look like an ignorant idiot, because what's going to happen is you're going to now be assessed as an attacker. So while you have the skill set, you have the capability, and you have the tool, because you didn't assess the situation properly, you go in guns blazing, quite literally, And you get yourself shot and killed because the cops don't know you fin from fro. You didn't assess the situation properly. And that's part of mastery. And part of that is failing. I mean, you have to kind of be put into weird situations where maybe you made the wrong choice. That's going to happen. And you have to be accountable to those choices. But I wanted to cover that because it did come up in the conversation in the comments of, well, where do we differentiate that? And admittedly, because we weren't getting into the minutia of what the difference is between courage, and we were just going off of the core value of courage, we didn't really cover what dictates and what determines courage from one to another. And so I wanted to cover it in mastery is I can spend 25 plus years learning a subject and becoming an expert and a master in that subject. But if I haven't taken the same amount of time to validate that echo chamber by surrounding myself with other people that have real world experience or tested those theories or tested that knowledge, book smarts will only get you so far. And if you don't have the real world and street wisdom to back it up, you're going to make a lot of bad choices, and you're going to implement techniques and skills that maybe you shouldn't. There's a lot of stories about, especially in California, which is now a no-fault state, but once upon a time, people would employ CPR on the scene of a crash or an incident, and they would end up doing more harm than good. They would, break necks, or there would already be a broken neck, and they would cause paralysis for life. Or, most people don't realize this, but when you apply CPR, it does have the potential, and typically does, if done right, crack the sternum and break and bruise the ribs, because you have to apply so much pressure to actually drop the chest to pump the blood in the lungs and the heart. And so when you do CPR, there is a high probability that bones will crack or bruise. And so people were getting sued left and right, and people were getting brought up or asked to be brought up and pressed charges against because they chose to implement CPR when they really weren't trained properly, and or they hadn't used it in such a long time, and they've never been in a situation, and so they would panic and make mistakes. And so, when it comes to mastery is a requirement because you have to contribute, if not to yourself, to your perimeter. And you have to be able to rely on the skill sets that you develop and hone to make choices and decisions on one way or the other, to make sure that the decisions you make in favorably for you or your tribe, whatever that looks like for you. So when I started the podcast and I made the decision to kind of outline these four virtues at a very high level, it didn't occur to me that there was going to be so much question on minutia, because I understood that they were very low-hanging fruit and they were very foundational, so they didn't have to be defined in a minutia. But as I've released these, and I really appreciate the feedback, this is why I don't want to be in an echo chamber, and why I solicit feedback from my listeners as heavy as I do, is I realize that I'm teaching from a place of ignorance. I'm teaching from the concept that I understand these the way that I do, but I don't necessarily know what pieces I need to break down into breadcrumbs for the audience until it's brought up. So these podcasts are going to be very much an evolving growth process for not only me, but also for the community. So any feedback, whether that's DMs, comments on my posts, comments on my podcast on the YouTube or on the Audible versions only, I see all of those. I respond to all of them. I absolutely appreciate any feedback. If you don't agree with me, I don't mind debates. I don't mind explanations. I actually enjoy and welcome them, because that's how we grow to further our mastery and understanding of the masculine man, how it applies in today's society, and also how do we cultivate that brotherhood where we can trust each other and be vulnerable to each other. So on that note, I do want to end this podcast with just a call to action. You understand what mastery is. Go develop a new skill. Whatever you've been afraid to do, we've talked about courage now. Put the fear aside and go get shit done. Go learn to play guitar. Even if the skill doesn't have to be utility, you can gain life knowledge from just the process of learning, understanding how you learn, understanding how you communicate, how you interact with different things. We will be providing a lot of tactics and mastery within this podcast, and as well as within the group on Heroes Veritas. So in the future, if there's something you want to learn and you don't know about, I think I recently shared how to make a bowline knot, which is a very simple knot, but is very helpful if somebody falls down a ravine. It's called a rescue knot. And that seemed to resonate with a lot of people. So go develop a skill. Go make things happen, and don't let fear stand in your way.